About 5 years into my incarceration, I got a letter, and she laid out to me who the man was that life I was responsible for taking. She said, despite the devastation you've caused, I forgive you. And not only do I forgive you, but I love you because that's what God will want me to do.
Wow.
The gift of forgiveness had already been given to me. I just wasn't able to
give it to yourself.
Give it to myself.
You weren't able to receive it.
Right, because I didn't know how to receive love. All of the articulations of love that I experienced in my life was on the other side of pain. Like, I'm beating you because I love you. And I just never forget, like, standing in the scratchy prison mirror, because they don't give you like real mirrors. But I remember standing in that mirror and just being like, I forgive you.
Did you fully forgive yourself in that?
Absolutely. It was the greatest expression of like self-love, but I also began to take responsibility for the harms that I caused. And that ability to write through and to sort out and to label and to identify and to define, that began to open up this bigger idea that maybe I am someone who can be forgiven.
This episode is sponsored by our partners at BetterHelp. You know, there is nothing wrong with asking for support in your life. It's actually a sign that you're paying attention. BetterHelp matches you with a qualified therapist online, and you can switch anytime if it's not the right fit. When life feels overwhelming, therapy can often help. If you sign up, you can receive 10% off at betterhelp.com/loveready. That's betterhelp.com/loveready. Today, I am having the honor and privilege of speaking to a man named Shaka Senghor. He's a best-selling author, speaker, and a powerful voice when it comes to personal transformation, growth, and healing. His memoir, Righting My Wrongs, became a national bestseller. Shaka was in prison for 19 years, and 7 of those years was in solitary confinement for murdering a man when he was 19 years old. His work now focuses on helping others break free from invisible prisons. Today, what we are going to be talking about is forgiveness and the power of forgiveness. I talk about forgiveness in my book, and there's a whole chapter that's called The Healing Power of Forgiveness. I know the power that forgiveness has had on my life. It is one of the greatest acts of love that we can give ourselves and each other. And you know, we're not talking about forgiveness enough. So I am just so looking forward to this conversation, where I hope that we can all learn more from a man who is very practiced in forgiveness. I'm so happy to have you here today, Shaka.
Oh, it's truly my honor to be here.
Shaka Senghor. Today we're going to have, I've been looking forward to this conversation since I learned about meeting you, and I'm doing as much research as I can in a short period of time about this man sitting across from me. And today I have the pleasure and honor of talking to you about forgiveness. Like, that is a topic that I don't talk to a lot of people about. And I think that you are practiced, and you have a lot to say about forgiveness. And I just think you're a teacher and a model of forgiveness.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing this time with me.
Oh, I'm truly honored. I mean, I think it's one of the conversations that really we need to lift up a lot more, because what I've found is that people really struggle with the deeper idea. What does it mean to forgive not only others, but what does it mean to forgive oneself, which is a lot more layered and very complex. So
it sure is.
Yeah.
It sure is.
Yeah.
So why don't we just start with that? Like, how would you describe forgiveness and the myths that are about forgiveness, misconceptions around it?
Yeah, I think, when I think about the gift of forgiveness, because it's one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves as well as extend to others, is the ability to free ourselves from a repeated story that we're constantly telling. The repeated pain that we constantly throw ourselves back into, and alleviating the burden of holding on to that and allowing it to hold us back and allowing it to limit our ability and capacity to love and just be present in our own lives. And so to me, I think the inability to forgive is one of our greatest hidden prisons, because somehow we think that we're punishing the person that we choose not to forgive without really deeply understanding how much we punish ourselves. So it's both a mechanism for release, but also a mechanism for deeper understanding of the self. And that's how I think about it. And that's how I've navigated in my own life.
Me too. I have a chapter in my book called The Healing Power of Forgiveness. It's a whole chapter. And you have a chapter in your book about forgiveness as well.
Yeah.
And I believe that forgiveness is like one of the most powerful acts of love. Yeah. It's love.
Absolutely.
In action.
Yeah.
You know, giving love to yourself and giving love to others.
Absolutely.
But I think what, let's go into your story before we you know, I would like to do that, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So you spent 19 years in prison. Yeah. That's a long time.
Yeah.
And 7 of those in isolation. Yeah. Like I have never talked to somebody or known somebody that spent time in jail. Yeah. So like I'm coming in with like just curiosity and an open mind and open heart and just like I want to learn. And I think a lot of people are in my place where it's just like we don't know what it's like to spend time in jail, in prison. Actually, you know what, Shaka? This is a side story, but I spent a day in jail when this is for real. I was 14 years old and I was stealing lipsticks. Wow. It was a very I had a collection going. And finally I got busted. Yeah. And we had a department store in Canada called The Bay. Yeah. And I was with my cousin. And my parents dropped us off at the mall for the day. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is my chance, right? Today, I'm going to I might take like 5. Like, today's the day. I'm going to how many can I do in one day? Right. And so what do you think happened? Yeah. I got busted. Yeah. My cousin didn't know. And anyways, we spent the day in jail because my dad was like, I'm not picking you up. Like, and he said to the guy, the security guy, like, how long can you keep her? Like, as long as possible, and then I'll pick her up. And so they picked me up at like 6 p.m. Yeah. That was I spent one day, but it was not like what you experienced.
Yeah, I mean, I think jail in general, which is different from prison because that's the more procedural part of the incarceration system is what happens before you're found guilty is you go to jail. Okay. You go through a whole court trial, all the things. Yes. But, what I tell people is that, any amount of time that you're up under somebody else's control and dominion is devastating. So whether it's one day or whether it's 1,000 days, it leaves a mark and it leaves a scar that's almost impossible to remove. And so you have to figure out how to navigate it. For me, going into prison, what I tell people now is that I was incarcerated before I was ever arrested because I bought into a narrative that said my life can only have 1 or 2 outcomes. I would be dead or in jail by the time I was 21. And when I looked around my neighborhood, I saw that as a consistent outcome for the men that I grew up with, as well as the men within my own family. Both of my older brothers were shot. Both of them ended up going to prison shortly after that. And so when I bought into that narrative, I lived my life with that understanding that this is the outcome that I'm moving toward. And when I actually went to prison, I was incarcerated at the age of 19 for second-degree homicide, and I got into a conflict during a drug transaction that I refused to make. That drug transaction escalated, and sadly and unfortunately, I fired 4 shots that tragically caused a man's death. It is, one of the most regrettable moments of my life, as anyone can imagine, and it was that moment that led to the next 2 decades of self-discovery, self-forgiveness, self-hatred, so to speak, and anger and bitterness and all the things that come with failing at the highest level of life, causing devastation and causing harm that you can't go and undo. And so when I went into the prison system at 19, I was bitter, I was angry. I made a vow to actually self-destruct even further, to where I was like, I'm not following any of the rules. And that's what I did. My first year in the prison, I had my security level increased to maximum security, and I hadn't even turned 20 yet. And I'm in this maximum security prison with a bunch of adult men who are 30, 35, 40 years old who had been spending time. And it was because I was labeled as the worst of the worst. I was getting in that much trouble, but it was in that environment where I met some of the most brilliant, masterful mentors, and they were the ones who started me on this journey of self-acceptance, self-forgiveness, but it was a long, long, winding journey. It wasn't after school specialists. People want you to have your kind of come to Jesus moments, But these men, they found their way in. They saw that I was pretty smart. I was a great communicator, and they guided me to books. And books just kind of shattered all these ideas I held about myself, and it really allowed me to explore, allowed me to be curious, and eventually it got to a space where I started reading with purpose to deepen my knowledge base and to really understand myself at a deeper level.
And you talk about how like your family was I related to this because you said it was like a family of, there was of course love and family and friends, and it was like your open door policy. Your parents were the parents that, were like the gathering place and music. And so you had, and you had dreams of being a doctor one day, right? And so what was that like growing up in your home before, your parents separated and then, things changed?
Yeah, it was a very, very complex household. I mean, on the outside looking in, it looked like the model for like working class America. My dad was in the Air Force, and he also worked for the state in the mental health field. My mother was primarily a homemaker, but sadly and unfortunately, our household was very abusive. My mother was very violent with her children. Years later, I really began to understand why and how she became who she was to her children, and realized that she was just repeating this horrendous cycle that started in her childhood. But growing up, I suffered a lot of abuse. I suffered in our household, and that led to me running away. And when I ran away, I was just like this naive kid. I had these dreams. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be an artist. And when the abuse just got to a breaking point, I decided to run away. And, I ran away. I'm this innocent kid. I'm thinking, hey, somebody would see this kid and take me in and wrap me in the warmth that I think all children are deserving of. But instead, I found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade. And this was when this drug was new. It was just being introduced to America broadly. So I was clueless about the devastation that this life would lend me very early on. And within the first 6 months of that culture, my childhood friend was murdered. I was robbed at gunpoint. I was beat nearly to death. I became addicted to crack cocaine at the age of 14. Wow. And I was fortunate, like now when I look back and think about the building blocks of resilience, I was fortunate to like be able to break that addiction on my own.
Wow.
I just realized that I like having money and sneakers more than I like being high.
Yeah.
So,
but the fact that you're 14 years old and you're addicted to crack, and like how you were able to recover an addiction by yourself, like holy cow.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking back on that part of my life, it's always sad, but it's also, there's a beauty in seeing a kid that's resilient and navigating very tough circumstances. And so I was in that culture for a few years, and then when I was 17 years old, I got shot multiple times, standing on the corner of my block. And after I got shot, I was rushed to the hospital by a friend of mine at the time, and it was just very procedural. They extracted 2 bullets, they left 1 bullet in, patched me up, and I was home. There was no doctor, there was no therapist, no social worker to just say, hey, this shouldn't have happened to you.
And you said in your book, like your story, that nobody was there to see. You didn't have friends and family come and see you in the hospital. I mean, you had just been shot like 4 times, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like the loneliness that you're like, I'm alone in this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's where, I really, in that moment, I think that was kind of like the final breaking stages of kind of giving up on anything other than what my life outcomes could be. And so probably it was about 16 months after that I found myself being arrested and charged with a very serious crime and going into this world that was very violent. Prison is a very volatile, chaotic, brutal environment. And so I went in with that understanding that this is my lot in life, and never thinking that I would ever leave that environment until I met these incredible mentors who guided me to books. And once I started reading, I still wasn't convinced that I would ever get out of prison, but I can escape mentally through books. Wow. And so I went on that journey, and then I'll never forget this moment. I actually worked in a recreation department at the time, and my supervisor
in the prison you worked?
In the prison, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the prison you have to work. So in our prison system, when you go to prison, you are subjected to involuntary servitude, which is just a fancier way of saying free labor or slavery. So my first job in prison was like 23 cents an hour. And then, I've had a variety of jobs. I worked in the kitchen, I worked in the law library, and I realized like early on that I wouldn't do a job that wasn't in service of the men I was serving time with. So they would give me jobs and I would refuse to work. I'm like, I'm not going to voluntarily be doing slave-based work, but I will work to help other people. And so for most of my incarceration, I worked either in recreation, which allowed me to service, the men inside, or I worked in the law library, which allowed me to put my mind to great use, helping people appeal their cases, or I worked as like a tutor, which was helping people learn to read. But at this time, I worked in recreation. I remember my supervisor just asked me one day, he was like, you seem to be very brilliant, and it's clear you're a great leader. You're leading these men the wrong way, but clearly they believe in you and they follow you and they respect you. And he was like, what else can you do with your mind? And I just remember like that.
And who was this that said this?
This was my supervisor. His name was Tom Scheidt.
So he was a guard.
Well, he wasn't a guard. He worked in the prison. He was like more, so you have the guards and then you have like civilian employees, right? And so the guards are they're there to keep you in and lock down the prison and break up the fights and stabbings. His role was more like, how do I, make sure that these guys have outlets while they're here? So he ran basketball programs, football programs, weightlifting. And my role in that was to organize it and to make sure people were able to access the things that they needed. He and I, we would talk a lot, and when you work in prison, you're not supposed to become friends with anybody and build those relationships.
That was interesting to me, Shaka, to learn when I was listening to your story.
Yeah.
You're, like you just said, you're not, it's like totally frowned upon. You're not allowed to befriend each other.
Yeah.
So that's the culture. That's like, it's almost like an unspoken rule, right?
Absolutely.
And that right there to me is like, wow. When I learned that, I didn't, I've seen it in the movies and everything, but really the movies aren't the truth, right? Yeah. So what they're trying to do already is like, it's all about division.
Absolutely.
Like, because if you make friends, like you might cause more trouble, or what is that about? What is that culture about?
I think they're afraid that, there's the mystery that we're so charismatic and manipulative that we'll manipulate them into, making poor decisions about their job or smuggling drugs in or things. And those things do happen. But also people have agency, right? There's people who can decide whether they want to break rules or not. And, the people working in prison are no different. I used to lack empathy and compassion for people who worked in that environment because it was a very us versus them mentality. But as I evolved in my thinking, I realized like those people are incarcerated as much as we are, with the exception that they can go home and take a nap and spend a little bit of time with their family. But for the most part, because they're working class, a lot of them work very long shifts. Sometimes they're working 80, 90 hours a week in prison. So they're really spending more time in prison than with their own families.
Wow.
And, as I began to mature and grow and understanding of how these ecosystems impact not just families, but society, I started to have a little bit more empathy and compassion, at least for the ones who showed up with whatever smidget of humanity that they had, which is very tough when the system itself is telling you, hey, you can work around this person, you can supervise this person, but don't you dare make a human connection. And what made Tom really special is he said, I'm going to break those rules and I'm going to be a human and I'm going to be thoughtful about the conversations that I have with these young men. And he became like one of the greatest leaders and most well-respected because he always saw us, as humans. And that was really powerful experience to have.
Like that, like you're in jail, prison. Yeah. You are living out your punishment, right, for the crime. Yeah. But then you're also treated inhumanely and you're not a human. And that in itself, that's just devastating. How are we expecting people to come out of this situation and be like, great in society? Yeah. So that the system is broken. Like I know that, but I don't know much more than that. That you're teaching me. Yeah. Can we talk about your road to forgiveness and learning about forgiveness? Because I've had my experience and practice in forgiveness, and now when things happen in my life, because I am practiced at it, it's like, oh, even though I don't want to sometimes, I'm like, okay, I'm going to forgive because I know the power of it. So can we talk about how did you start the road to forgiveness and how did you learn?
It's a great question. I would say the first time that I ever really had to grapple with this big idea of forgiveness was really around self-forgiveness.
Yeah.
I was always the helpful kid. I was always the one who would, help the, ladies in the neighborhood with their groceries and hold the door open for people and break up the fights with my friend. So I didn't see myself as this villain that the system saw me as. I didn't see myself as a bad person early on. But when I committed what is one of the worst crimes that you can commit, at 19 years old, I began to see myself solely through that moment. And I began to define myself through that moment as this monster that's devastated this family. And about 5 years into my incarceration, I got a letter from a woman named Nancy. And Nancy wrote me this letter, and she laid out to me who the man was that life I was responsible for taking. This man who was a husband, he was a father, he was a friend. And I remember reading that letter and just wanting to ball it up.
Yeah.
I did not want to confront the devastation that I had caused and the pain that I caused. And, so I'm reading this letter basically with trembling hands, and something was like, keep reading.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, she said, despite the devastation you've caused, I forgive you. And not only do I forgive you, but I love you because that's what God will want me to do.
Wow.
And I was probably 25 at that time, 24, somewhere in there. And I was incapable of receiving this beautiful gift that this woman was bestowing upon me. But I didn't throw the letter away. I would just read the letter over and over, trying to feel.
It's just like, yeah, and you're like, right.
Yeah.
Because you say up until that point, you weren't able to cry, right? And that was,
Yeah.
And this is 5 years into your incarceration.
Yeah. And so I got the letter. I would just read it over and over and just try to feel like where this woman was coming from. And then her and I started to correspond. And I remember one time in our correspondence, she was like, who was that 19-year-old? Like, who was that person? And she was like, just be real with me. Like, don't give me the sanitized version to make me feel good.
Like, tell me about him.
Yeah, who are you, right? And just that ability to correspond with somebody who had all the reason in the world to be angry toward me and to be not even reach out to me. That correspondence started to kind of awaken this idea that I was capable of forgiving myself. And a couple of years later, I was in solitary confinement. Yeah. A couple of years later, I was in solitary confinement, and I started this journaling. I had got into reading philosophy. I was reading Socrates' Apology. And I came across this line that literally changed my life. It was like, the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so through that, I started asking myself this question, like, how did I end up here? How did I end up becoming the kid who could pull the trigger? How did I go from this kid who wanted to help other people and to navigate life in this caring way to like doing one of the most harmful things in the world? And that journaling allowed me to really answer the tough questions of what happened to me. And I began to write and journal about all the things that I had experienced, all the devastating things that had happened to my young body. And I found myself being compassionate toward this kid who was in basically survival mode since I was probably 6 or 7 years old. But I also began to take responsibility for the harms that I caused. And that ability to write through and to sort out and to label and to identify and to define, that began to open up this bigger idea that maybe I am someone who can be forgiven. Because the set of circumstances that I was born into, the devastation that I had experienced, shaped how I would react in a moment of conflict. And I just never forget, like, standing in this scratchy prison mirror, because they don't give you like real mirrors. It's just like a scratchy piece of steel. You can barely see the details of yourself. But I remember standing in that mirror and just being like, I forgive you, and to be able to sit with myself and just say, like, I forgive you.
So was it like a moment and you felt it? Like, did you fully forgive yourself in that?
Absolutely.
You did.
It was the greatest expression of like self-love
Yeah.
and self-acceptance. And part of the process was like, not just forgiving myself, but accepting all of who I am.
Yeah.
I grew up with all these insecurities that had been physically beaten to me. The way that my hair looked, the way that my gap teeth were, and all these things. And so that process of forgiveness was accepting
Yeah.
that, your gap tooth smile is special.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to smile, and that your hair is beautiful, and that, all these things that you actually are smart, and you're not, someone who's incapable. And so that process of self-forgiveness was really about self-love, because the gift of forgiveness had already been given to me. I just wasn't able to
give it to yourself.
Give it to myself.
You weren't able to receive it.
Right, to receive it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, because I didn't know how to receive love.
Yes.
All of the articulations of love that I experienced in my life was on the other side of pain. Like, I'm beating you because I love you. I'm punishing you because I love you. Yeah. And that's a very confusing message for a kid to, go through, right? I'm abandoning you and I'm gonna let you figure your life out because I love you.
Right.
And so it wasn't until I started to get to the space of like, what does compassionate love look like? What does empathetic love look like? And that leading to that deeper sense of self-love, that's when I was able to receive that beautiful gift that Nancy gave me. And it was life-changing.
Wow. And then you wrote a letter to the man that you killed.
Yeah.
Wow. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so through that process, of really understanding at a deeper level the devastation I caused, what I realized is that in that moment of anger and, fear and paranoia and all the things that were happening, is that I let go of my own humanity, which didn't allow me to see the humanity of David, whose life I was responsible for taking. And so I started to write this letter to deepen my own understanding of, what does it mean to be human when you've fallen, short in life, and when you've caused devastation and you've caused harm. Like, what does that mean to be human? And the only way I felt that I could really get to that was to write a letter and explain, like, what happened that night. Mm-hmm. The way that our criminal justice system and our society is set up is that we have flash judgments. And anytime that there's an explanation, somehow we equate an explanation to an excuse. And I don't think you can solve problems without understanding how a problem came to be. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to articulate, how I got there. How did I get to that night in that moment in time? Mm-hmm. And, for myself and others, because I realized that at some point I would get released back to society. 90% of people who go to prison get out in America. And I had a responsibility when I came home to help other young men. It's the greatest way that I can, be in service of the life that I took, is to ensure that other people had the tools to make different decisions than I made, to mentor those young men who potentially could find themselves at 2 a.m. with a gun in their hand in the middle of a conflict and know what to do in that moment, things that I didn't know what to do.
Right. You didn't have a mentor. You didn't have somebody that, right?
Yeah, there was no, expression of, hey, you should get therapy. I mean, at 17, you don't know, you just don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so that's what led me to writing that letter, is this deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
Wow. And you spent all this time by yourself in isolation. Like, that in itself is torture. I can't imagine being, are you allowed out during the day and then you go back into your cell at night? Like, you're in isolation?
Solitary confinement in America is one of the most barbaric and inhumane parts of our system and what we do to people. One, because there's a high level of pre-existing mental health challenges that the men that I was around face. So people who have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, they're highly likely to find themselves in solitary confinement because our system just hasn't figured out how to treat mental health, so they criminalize it. But it's a devastating environment. You know, the brutality of being in an environment where you're watching people disintegrate into madness on a day-to-day basis is one of the most harrowing, experiences that I've ever had. The smell still stays with me, the smell of bodily fluids being thrown on each other, feces, urine, spit, whatever you name it. The noise of people beating on lockers and beating on, steel sinks and toilets. And so I found myself in that environment, where you're locked down 23 hours a day for 5 days a week. The other hour they take you out to a cage. They basically put you in these handcuffs that's attached to a dog leash, and then they walk you out to what's the equivalent of a dog kennel. And legally, they have to at least give you access to that for an hour, 5 days a week. And then the other 2 days, you're just locked down for 24 hours in a cell with a steel door. There's a shutter on the window, so you can't see out the thing. You can look up under the door, or you can look down a little crack. And we just learn to communicate. We talk through toilets. If you take all the water out of your toilet, you can talk to other guys in the cell block. We talk through light sockets. You can talk to the person downstairs, or we just hollered up under the door to communicate. And, I was really lucky. I believe that in life, there are some people who are fortunate to be lucky. They may be born into the right zip code, may be born into the right family. They may be born with a certain set of biological gifts that, not everyone has. Not many people are going to be 6'8", 250 pounds like LeBron James. My luck was that I was actually literate. And because I was literate, I was able to really understand the environment that I was in. I was able to escape through the written word. On tough days, I would just open up, Nelson Mandela's biography and read that, just a few words of this person has got through tough things. And that was my saving grace, along with really understanding what solitary was designed to do. There's a book called Cages of Steel that really lays out, here's exactly what, solitary confinement does to a human being. Mm-hmm. The way that it makes you hallucinate, mm-hmm. the way that it makes you second guess any decision that you're making, the way that it makes you dependent on your jailers. I saw how that played out when during the pandemic, where people who were forced to be isolated in their home was coming apart.
Yes.
So you imagine, you shrink that down to a little contained room, smaller than most bathrooms, and you think about what that's like. And you think about that there's no programming. There's no kind of hey, we're going to keep you here, but we're going to give you some tools to figure out your life when you get out. So basically, you're just thrown in there and you're left to figure it out on your own. For me, I was really lucky to have literacy. And so while I was in there, I just started journaling and writing about my life and writing about dreams and goals and imagining a new life for myself after I got through self-forgiveness and self-love. And, I reflect on those years as, the years of me being able to deploy the luckiest thing about my life, which was being literate.
Wow.
This episode is sponsored by our partners at BetterHelp. In the course of my life, I've had a lot of experience with therapy. And in my job, what I do every day is I speak to relationship experts. I read all the books. But it wasn't until I actually started working with a qualified therapist that I trust, somebody that I built a relationship with over time, that this person has been able to help me with a lot of different things in my life. Because of therapy, I've become a better mom, a better partner, a better leader in my company. BetterHelp makes it possible for anyone to access that kind of support. When life feels overwhelming, therapy can help. If you sign up, you'll receive 10% off at betterhelp.com/loveready. That's betterhelp.com/loveready.
How do you mentor people on asking for forgiveness?
So that's a great question. One of the things that whenever I'm advising anybody on, I just try to give them contextual of this was my experience,
Yes.
Because everybody's outcomes are not going to be the same, but one of the biggest things that I try to do is to let them know that you can have no expectation that the other person will respond
Or forgive you.
or forgive, right?
Right.
And if you can live with that, then I highly encourage, reaching out in whatever format works for you. And, for me, writing has, it's such an interesting thing when I think about thematically all of my work, right? If you look at my 3 books that currently exist in the world, letters really informs a lot of the way that I write. In my first memoir, there's a couple of letters that really shaped that story. My second book is a book of letters, actually, to my sons. And it's just kind of like my thoughts about these different philosophical, outlooks on life. And then in my latest book, How to Be Free, I talk about the power of writing letters or journaling. And for me, what that is that it's one of the greatest ways that I think we get our brains to move forward. When I wrote about like suicidal ideation, like I attempted to commit suicide when I was 16. I was just devastated and felt isolated and abandoned and, unloved. And what I realized is that writing allows me to move forward in life and just my ideas, my thoughts. And so it's a very therapeutic approach to it. And then there's a I think it's a lost art, of just like writing people letters.
Right.
And there's something about when you sit down, the intimacy of it. And, the beauty of deep connection in that way. And so it's just informed my overall writing because I know I feel, I was in prison for 19 years and it was the most dominant form of communication. So some of it is probably like just the default of that. It's writing me and my dad writing back and forth and, different people I've written over the years. But there's so much power in a written letter. And there's so much power in journaling, which I talk a lot about in the book as part of that therapeutic, liberating framework is being able to just get honest with yourself. And I will say this, I always tell people, like, if you're going to journal, you have to set a high bar for yourself. Like the bar I set for myself is only journal at that point in which you're willing to get brutally honest with yourself. Because it's easy to shrink on a page, or it's easy to say, that is too ugly or too hurtful or too harmful. But you do yourself a disservice when you back away from the discomfort of things that may not be beautiful. And so the same is true for letter writing as well.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So the one thought I had this morning when I was listening to your book was about love. And you had, like, you're surrounded in an environment that is like the opposite of love. But there are, like, I just wanted to ask you about, like, what did you see and feel? What were the things that you could point out that, like, okay, that was a demonstration of love?
While I was incarcerated?
Yeah.
There weren't many things that I felt were an expression, like when I was in the moments, that was a real expression of love, until I started going on this healing journey and really started to just write about the interior part of my life. How do I think about family and friends, and how do they think about me? And I would say the greatest expression was my dad's dedication to me for 19 years and his willingness to, sacrifice whatever he needed to sacrifice to come see me. And the letters we exchanged during that time, which were, great explorations of like manhood, and a parental relationship. And, my dad's, navigating what is it like to have a child incarcerated and how devastating that was for him. And then the other thing was the communal nature of rallying around our own suffering with the other men inside, and that how we would just show up for each other during the darkest moments. Even in solitary, we would, you may get a guy on the tier who can sing, and, at nighttime he would sing and we would all just listen. And, you may get someone who's comedic and they're telling these, fantastical tales that aren't true, but they're hilarious. I would tutor the other men on the tier and, try to help them read. And I had a neighbor who tried to help me, learn Spanish. So it was this very kind of communal nature that we did at the lowest of our moments, the way that we would just try to take care of each other.
Yes.
There was intentional care in the midst of chaos and violence, which was like, the greatest contradictions of life is you see this extraordinary beauty in a, horrendous environment. And so that, as I began to write more, I really began to understand that we were capable of love and care, even though that wasn't the narrative around our lives. And then once I began writing, the men in the cell block, they became the greatest champions of my transformation. They would sign a list. It would be a sign-up list to read my books, my handwritten books.
Wow.
And they would give great feedback, and they would talk about the characters, and they would just kind of, encourage me. And these men who saw me at the beginning stages of my incarceration, where I was this rebellious teenager, and they saw me mature into a man and a man of purpose. And they just was like, I know you're going to get out there and do what you said, and like their confidence and my ability, their willingness to listen to the crazy big ideas that I had about what I would do as a writer and not, poo-poo it away or not doubt me. Like that was, incredible expression of love and care and support, and I miss that. I miss the camaraderie that I had with my friends inside. It's one of the hardest parts about being free on this side is those friendships. They were really sacred. They were really special. They were formed up under the most adversarial of conditions. And, I wouldn't be the man that I am today without their wisdom, without their insight, without their willingness to challenge me on things and help me grow.
Yeah. So you made good friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
So was it recently that you received a letter from the man who shot you when you were 17?
Yeah.
Wow.
When we're talking about forgiveness, which, is one of the things that I write about in my latest book. Forgiveness is deep. I remember thinking that I forgave my mother.
It is deep.
Yeah.
Yes. The story about you forgiving your mom and how your brother was like, it was like conditional forgiveness, right? It's like, I forgave her, but she's still, she's still mom, right? Like she's still acting the way that she, well, that's not true forgiveness then. Like,
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of us do when we think that we bestow, this magical wand of forgiveness on others, and it's really all about our own ego.
Yes.
The idea that I can give you something that will somehow transform you into what I want you to be.
Right.
And I think, for me, forgiving my mother, somehow I just thought this is like this noble thing to do is like to forgive her, but then she must behave in a very particular manner. And, I remember me and my brother having this great conversation about where we're at with our relationship with our mom, and him being like, I forgave her, but then she does this thing, and then we're right back to square one. And it was just like all these lights went off in my head. It's like, whoa, like I'm no different. I forgive her, but I keep my distance. And I forgive her, but whenever that thing comes up that I don't like, then I kind of retreat back into this safe space. And it really came full circle when I got this letter from the man who shot me. And I didn't realize how much I needed that letter to clarify for myself what forgiveness is. And, and I always tell people this is like, you have to be really careful what you wish for in life and very careful about what you say you stand for in life. And as someone who has said consistently, I don't think people should be defined by their worst moments. When I got that letter, all the things about my life came full circle, became very present. And my initial reaction to the letter was not, a pleasant thought about, oh, I should just forgive this person who devastated my life and who really, set into motion a chain of events that led me down a very particular path. This guy, he was in prison where he's currently at, and he sees a guy with a book that another guy is reading a book, and he asked him about the book, and, he lets him read the book, and it was my memoir. I
Think
remember
about that.
writing my wrongs, which was like the wild thing, right? And so he starts to read this book. And as he's reading the part where I talk about getting shot, I don't name his name. I just name the details of what happened. I didn't even know his name, actually. And he realized that he's the person who shot me. And so we have a mutual friend, and he sends the letter to that friend. And my friend, Rick, he calls me. He's like, yo, I got this letter from this guy. Do you know this name? I'm like, I don't know that name. Who is this guy? And he's like, well, what about, do you know this woman? This is her child's father, and he's the one who shot you. And so I get the letter, and I'm just reading the letter, and all the things are coming up, right? The moment of being shot, the anger that I felt, the spiraling that happened as a result. And I'm really angry. I'm like, he's in a very vulnerable position. I'm well loved in prison, well respected. I can probably get him taken care of for less than $1,000. It doesn't cost that much in prison. And so all those things, those are real feelings that come up, real thoughts that came up. And, I think this is an important part of the forgiveness process, is you have to be real with what you feel.
Yes.
And I think where we miss the mark at a lot of the times is we want to leap over the bad feelings and get to this kind of positive idea we have. And I thought about the feelings. I thought about what I can have done to him.
Yeah, you're planning his demise.
Really,
like, I'm going to get that guy taken out.
really all the things, right?
Holy cow.
and then just the willingness to lean into those, feelings was like, that's not the person I am. It's not the person I want to be.
Yeah.
That's that 17-year-old's feelings. It's not my grown man feelings, it's 17-year-old's feelings.
Right.
Now, what do I feel as a grown man? And what I felt as a grown man was empathy and compassion. And I thought, like, this guy was me. Something had to have happened in his life.
Yes.
And he was willing to have the courage to write about it. And so I started to write him a letter back. And then I decided, I was like, well, I don't owe him that. That doesn't mean, that's not what forgiveness means, right? Because it's really not about him at this point. He wrote the letter he needed to write. Great, perfect, thank you. Doesn't mean we have to be besties or that I care to entertain you any further. And so what I did is I realized that I hadn't fully forgiven my mother. And so I wrote
that letter precipitated that, you realizing that you did not fully forgive your mom yet.
Yeah. And it really helped me get to this deeper level, and to my mother's credit, she's been courageous and super helpful in the process, because what she was willing to do was to open up her own life and share things about her own journey that a lot of times parents or people with caused harm are unwilling to do. So we've done this dance where she's just shared so many things that was like, oh, this woman has been through it before she was a woman. As a girl, all the assaults on her body, the abuse, the things. And I'm like, okay, she only did to us what was done to her.
Yeah.
And she can only do what she can do based on what her experiences were. And so I wrote her this letter, and it just was really about this journey her and I had went on where, we went on this trip together. It was the first time me and my mother ever traveled anywhere together, ever spent any significant amount of time outside of Detroit. So we were down in Florida, and we spent time together, and it was just beautiful to sit by the river and talk with her and just hear her stories and see this little girl who had never been taken care of, never been protected. And knowing that I was now in a position where I can protect that little girl and I can love on that little girl that existed inside, now my aging mother. And so I wrote the letter after getting that letter from this guy. And then I looked him up because I wanted to see his face. I didn't see his face when he shot me. And I didn't realize that was kind of like a ghost that floated in the background of my life. But it was that moment of forgiving him where I felt the mastery over the ability to forgive. And I say the mastery because there's layers to forgiveness, and those layers are like, you can verbally say, hey, I forgive you. And that's a stage, that's a part of it. And, but then feeling it, that's another layer of it, right? Where you actually feel like, I'm worthy of letting this thing go that's going to devastate my life if I hold on to it.
Yes.
And then you get to that third level, which is complete freedom of really letting the thing go.
Yeah.
And that when that thing comes up, it's as if it has no power, And so, my mother still has behaviors that triggers my siblings that don't trigger me because I've let it go. I've really let it go in the deepest ways. Because I understand she's operating out of a system that was given to her as a child, not of her own making.
You have like full acceptance of her. And the way I see it is like a non-attachment to, like you can see her in her fullness.
Absolutely.
And it's not like you're condoning those behaviors,
Yeah.
right? But you see her as, like she's not doing these things. She's being herself.
Yeah.
And if it was hurting you, yes, that's like circumstantial.
Yeah.
But I understand like the difference between like, if you're holding on to unforgiveness, it's like you're tied to that person, right?
Yeah.
It's like this connection and it's it's harming you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they may not even feel that, right? It's harming the person
they'll
that's
be
holding.
living their best life. They'll be somewhere living their best life, and you're over here torturing yourself. And I was like, I can't live in that torture. I can't live in somebody else's narrative. That's their life, right? The only thing I can do is be present in my own life. And that's part of what forgiveness is how much present do you want to be in your own life versus being stuck in an old story.
Oh,
and,
yes.
Unless a person is causing you physical harm or, something of that nature, or they're, doing something to take advantage of you. But if it's like they've done a thing, that thing no longer exists, it's already happened, it's over, but you're still stuck on that loop, you're doing yourself more damage than you will ever do them damage. That, ability to fully forgive and detach myself from any expectations. Because I think that's also a big part of it. It's like, even when in lighter things, because I mean, like, you're not going to have any human relationship without having to forgive, right?
Oh, yeah,
if you have
it's a regular thing.
Yeah, if you're like in a relationship, you're a parent, you're whatever, colleague, whatever, people we're human. We're gonna have, times where we trample over each other's feelings and we cause harm and we, get our feelings hurt. And then it's like, what do you choose to do with that?
Yeah, are you gonna hold on to
what are
that?
the choice, what are the choice you're making? I'm like, listen, I enjoy frolicking. I want to frolic. I want to be in joy. I want to be like, life is too short. It's and I mean, I've had a very particular life that's led me to a lot of these beliefs. My brother was murdered in July 2021. And as you can imagine, that's devastating. And I remember, there was opportunities where, the homies on the block, they're like, yeah, we're going to go take care of this guy's family. And I'm like, no, we're absolutely not. The best, greatest expression of love for my brother would be to go in there and hug my mother, to be able to support our family. And the way that I was able to actually get to that, because I had the anger as well, but I remember flying home to Detroit and I just started writing the person who killed my brother a letter. And the letter was about the idea that something devastating had to have happened to this person for him to pull the trigger, because he was my brother's friend.
Oh.
And so, I was like, well, whatever happened in your life that was so devastating that, it allowed you to pull the trigger and kill my brother, I understand how that can be. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't change anything. But just writing that out, just getting those words out of my head, it allowed me to show up even when I was angry in a way that was about healing. I'm no different than anybody else who grew up in the hood, where retribution is a regular part of how we navigate gun violence. You shoot my brother, I shoot you, I shoot your brother. It's just the cycle goes on. But in that moment, I know that was the guys in the neighborhood who wanted to go and retaliate. That was an expression of love. They loved my brother. And so as a expression of their love, they wanted to go and retaliate, because it's a misdirected form of love. It doesn't mean that they didn't love him. Mm-hmm. It's just that their interpretation of how you express love is filtered through trauma. And so as someone who's navigated it, my responsibility was to redirect it to real love, which is just go in there and give my mother a hug, that would make her happy. Like, she's not going to be happy if you go and shoot this guy's mother house up, or she goes and, causes more harm. Like, it's not gonna make her happy. And because they know I've been through enough things, they trust me enough to accept that wisdom.
Wow.
But I wouldn't have been at that wisdom had I not processed the things, right? The anger and so, forgiveness is an action word. It requires something of us.
It is an action word.
Yeah, it requires of us. It requires something deep. It's same thing with love. Love requires a deepness. It requires us to dig into things that aren't always comfortable. And so when I think about all these different layers of my life, they're layers, but they're also lessons. And, that's why I talk so freely about them.
Wow. And you have a son. Do you have more than one child?
I have two sons.
You have two sons.
I have a 34-year-old and a 14-year-old.
Oh, 34-year-old and 14. So your 34-year-old son is who you were writing. He wrote you a letter.
Yeah.
When you were, and said, like, Dad, like, I realize, that was a turning point for you as well.
Yeah.
I wondered about your changing generational patterns in how you are living your life now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of awareness and a lot of, you can have the thoughts, like, because it's almost programmed in. How is that?
Yeah, I think I do what's called egoless parenting.
Egoless parenting.
Yeah. I just try not to insert my own story into my younger son's life. He has his own journey. He's going to make his own mistakes. He's going to build his own friendships, and he'll come up with his own sense of identity. And what I found, like, when you approach parenting without your ego attached to their outcomes, it really makes parenting much more joyful.
Yes.
He's free to make his own decisions and mistakes, and with some light guardrails, which I think are important, is just to have light guardrails. But I try to give my son as much agency as possible over his own life. It's not an easy thing to do as a parent, because you're like, oh, you're about to break all of those things over there, but sometimes you have to let them break them. You have to let them kind of color outside the lines to figure their life out. He's living a very different life from me, so I have to check in with myself. Whenever I'm making a more disciplined decision, I have to check in with myself. Like, is this my old stuff? Or is this is this really relevant to the moment of now? Which isn't easy to do as a parent, right? Because we're like, we're in it, we want to fix it, we want to solve it. But I think children become more resilient when they get a chance to make their own mistakes. I think they become much more wise when they get a chance to form their own friendships, and they get a chance to explore life. And so I try to do as much of that as possible. That's not always easy, because like we have our parenting dynamic is, I'm married, so I have a wife. He has a bonus mom, and he has his biological mom. So there's like two moms and one dad, and him, and so there's a lot of navigating decision making and what that looks like. I think just naturally, I'm much more get out the way and see what happens than I am like more kind of, on top of things. My wife her background is an educator. She was a principal. She's worked a lot with teens over the years. And so she's great at really, putting structural things in place. His mother, she's also an educator. So there's times I defer to their wisdom. And, and then it's a matter of them navigating and trusting my wisdom, which is a little more reckless, which is also a lot more fun. So, it's incredible to be at this stage of life where my youngest is 14 now. He's getting ready for high school. I think this is the first time that I've ever felt any kind of a little bit of anxiety, because I'm like, oh man, he's about to go into the real stuff. And then I just was like, you know what? You mentor. I mentor a lot of kids across the country.
Yeah.
I have a lot of mentees who have gone on to live well-adjusted, great young adult lives, and they still check in with me. So I feel like even if it's not just me, I can put him around
the people,
other mentees that are like, oh yeah, your dad's actually pretty dope. He knows what he's talking about. So I think he'll be fine.
Yes.
And if he makes mistakes, I mean, I'm sure he'll make some mistakes and he'll have some poor decision moments. There's a safe place for him to land.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest thing.
I think one of the greatest gifts that you're giving your son, your children, is the example that you're living now, right? You're being present. Like, my dad taught me forgiveness. Like, he was my teacher on how to do it. Like, his mom left him and his siblings when he was young. Like, she up and left, right? And when your mom leaves, it's like, and you ran away and your mom didn't come get you. So when I listened to that in your story, I was like, that's devastating, because your own mother didn't come and get you. I mean, you were a kid that ran away. It's like, come back home. Like, you need to be home with me. But she didn't do that. And so you were abandoned, right? And so my dad went through that, and he lived his life. He forgave his mom, and he welcomed her back into our family when I was a teenager. And I couldn't understand it. I was mad at my grandma. I'm like, what the heck, Dad? Like, I was giving him shit. Like, this isn't right. How can you possibly forgive a woman that left you? Like, if mom left me, I don't know, I'm thinking that it's right at my righteous self. I couldn't understand it. And he was like, Robin, like, you need to drop whatever you're carrying for me. I let that go a long time ago. Like, I don't want you to carry anything for me. And also, like, I have no attachment to that. Like, I love her. He was able to see that she had a very hard life growing up. So, that gift that you are giving your children on mentoring and modeling what forgiveness is and the power of that, it's a huge gift. So
no, I think your dad's right. We do try to carry things for other people, and it's tough when you see someone you love that's been hurt.
And that's what your brother's friends were doing, right? They were like, I'm going to take this on for him. Like, absolutely. you think that is love, but that's not love. So we're it's like, we need a re-education on what love really is.
Absolutely.
Shaka, what is your perspective on giving collective forgiveness for, like, the harm that we're seeing in the world now, or the atrocities that we're seeing? Like, what is your thought on, like, big level forgiveness, like systems?
I mean, that's a great question. It's also a really tough question.
Yes.
And I think it's tough because what is required for us collectively is to be honest. And we are so fragile and so weak when it comes to being honest about the historical harms that have been caused and the cultural harms that continue to be caused. And until we can get real with ourselves, we'll never be able to be in a space of collective forgiveness, because what's happening is that one harm begets another harm. But I think there's incredible examples of what's possible, like truth and reconciliation. And what happened, when that was led by Bishop Desmond Tutu, and this idea that you have to name a thing, you have to name the harms in order to heal from them collectively. And, and the other part of it is that sometimes we just give up too much agency over our lives to these big kind of systems, and we stop showing up in our interpersonal relationships. And I think that's where the magic is really at. Is like, how do you treat your fellow person? How do you hold space for truths that may be dramatically different from your experience? And I encounter that in my work all the time, where, I was just at a school, and it's Iowa, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's not many Black people in that community. And we were just talking about, how do you inspire young people to read? And I'm like, they have to see themselves in stories. Why can't we just say that? Why can't we just say that a lot of times the literature that's taught in schools don't include Black males in their experience? And if you can just say it, then you can solve it. Then you can find Black writers that actually write about the experience. And then we can just say, hey, it's actually okay that, yes, we're both American or whatever, but we actually have a very different lived experience. And here's what I learned from my experience, and what have you learned from your experience? So, I think the ultimate hack is curiosity, leaning into being curious about things that are different from us. And it works both ways. It's not like a one-off, right? And I think we do too much of the kind of ideas where we had this grand idea that somehow the government is going to get it right, but then we, the people, don't get it right because we're so busy judging them that we forget we have opportunities that exist right in our own community, and we don't show up in that. And so collective forgiveness requires a lot of truth-telling, and we have not done a great job at telling the truth. And some reason, as tough and resilient as America has been, and I'm sure that's true of other countries, we're super fragile when it comes to the truth.
Wow.
And until we get to that, we'll be stuck in that cycle.
We need to get to the truth of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. So I ask our guests 2 questions before we close.
Yeah.
The first is, what is one myth about love? What we need to unlearn?
I think one myth about love that we need to unlearn is that it's all stars and rainbows all of the time. Love, at its core, is really the greatest life lesson planner. And like when you really understand that part of it, it's not going to be all, rainbows and shiny stars. It's going to be tough moments. It's going to be sad moments, disappointing moments. And if you can live with that, you can truly love.
Yeah. And so what is how do you describe love?
I describe love as the greatest human connection, the deepest human connection, the deepest mirror of our soul as reflected in life, whether it's the love of ourselves, the love of others, the love of the environment that we get a chance to coexist in. I just think it's a mirror of the soul. I was in Iowa like earlier this week, and the greatest urge I had was to see bald eagles.
Yes.
And, I went and saw those beautiful, majestic birds and was just struck with the power and beauty of this life we get a chance to bear witness to. And to me, that's the greatest expression of love, is to lean into those moments, whether with ourselves or with others.
Yeah. So I'm so grateful for this time together today, Shaka.
Truly an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Follow us at Real Love Ready and at Soulprint Media Co. on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Real Love Ready series is a Soulprint Media production, presented by BetterHelp, hosted by me, Robin Ducharme. Executive producers are Robin Ducharme, John Kim, Tara Malhotra Feinberg, Hilary Swanson. Produced by Miriam Debbie Talbot, Tara Malhotra Feinberg. Directed by Miriam Debbie Talbot. Edited by Susie Landers O'Connell. Director of Photography, Scott Simic.